We'll go ahead and call our Thursday, August 24, 2023 Roanoke County School Board work session to order. Madam Clerk, can you call the roll, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Here.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. 2.01, discussion from County Administrator of recent Roanoke County PPEA projects, Mr. Todd Kegels.
And he's on his way, so let me introduce our guest. So if you recall, at the last work session, we had just a good discussion about our procurement and construction processes. One of the suggestions a couple of you made was, we know that the county side has some good experience with these different methods and so forth. So could we reach out to them and ask them to do some sharing? So Mr. K. Wood was gracious to agree to do that and drug along Mr. Blunt, who may have been willing to do it. But anyway, we appreciate Richard K. Wood, of course, our county administrator, as well as Doug Blunt, our assistant county administrator, for being with us today. Their slides are here in a printout, and I'll just turn it over to them. Appreciate you being here.
Well, we appreciate you having us. Let me see how to work the technology here, so I should be able to advance it here. Well, first, we appreciate the invitation, and as these three projects has been worked on a number of times, I've told Dr. Nicely that we would be happy to help in any way that we could, and we hope what we share today will be helpful. I will start out by saying that I haven't watched all the past discussions, so some of this may be a little bit basic, but I kind of wanted to start not assuming a base of knowledge and then work from there. And just a couple quick disclaimers. While I am a licensed engineer, I do not have a law license. A whole lot of the questions that you get into when you talk about this field are legal in nature, and while I'm familiar with some of them, I don't want to try to answer any of those questions later on, because we spend a lot of time with our own county attorney's office when we're working on capital procurement, because again, you do get quickly into legal issues. Obviously, you guys make your own procurement decisions, and then what Doug and I are going to share is just based on our own experiences at the county, some of my experiences prior to being here, and these are our own opinions, because again, just about everything that I will share today, there's somebody out there that would debate those points if you look at any of the articles and professional publications, particularly when you're talking about the pros and cons of design build and design bid build. Just for some background with our projects, we have done a mix of both, and it looks like we're probably running about 50-50 as to which method that we choose to use for our procurement. The three library projects that everybody's familiar with were all design bid build, as was some significant renovations at our social services building, which is in downtown Salem. Our public service center relocation, which is an ongoing project. They were all procured that way. And then PPEA/design build, public safety building just around the corner, Green Ridge, Police Academy, that was actually administered jointly with the city of Roanoke, because they actually owned the building to which we added on. And then the active project of the Bonsai Fire Station. In our opinion, both these methods have pros and cons, and we kind of make a project by project decision which one we want to use. Just from our experience, one of the things that really differs between the methods is how you do risk allocation. Different contracting vehicles put different risk on the owner, different risk on the other private parties involved. And generally speaking, you should expect to pay when you transfer risk from the owner to somebody else. So there's a cost for that. And then even within a given method, especially the one I'm most familiar with, design bid build, depending on how that contract is structured, risk allocation can be different. And a good example I'll use from my past with VDOT is a fair amount of VDOT construction is not only design bid build, it's also unit price. In other words, it's not a lump sum for the job. It's tons of steel, tons of asphalt is broken out like that. And then to take that even further, there's often what are called cost adjustment factors. So for example, if the price of liquid asphalt goes up or down, they will actually adjust that unit price amount based on a published table that they put out every month. They sometimes do that with steel, also with fuel, because in that context, their goal is to have the contractor take as little risk as possible, because they're trying to get the absolute cheapest price Often, some of those projects are not time sensitive, so that's an extreme example of the owner trying to take all the risk. And then there's other methods where almost all the risk lies on the private side. Another one, just that regardless of which method you're using, if you put a big monetary penalty in a contract, that can represent a big risk for the person doing that work. And so that's going to be built into your price if they feel like there's a risk of being exposed to it, whether or not that happens or not. So sometimes, that's personally, I'm not always a big fan of penalties because you tend to pay for those whether or not the job finishes late or not. Whereas if you offer incentives, you typically only end up paying those if the job happens the way you want. But again, that's just another example of project risk. Just at a basic level, a design bid build, that's kind of the traditional method where the owner contracts with an architect or an engineer, you put together plans, you then develop a bid package that's put out for competitive bidding. And again, you can have that lump sum, unit price, or some combination thereof. Some of the pros and some of the reasons we use this on some of our projects is the traditional design bid build does give the owner the greatest control over the project design. So for example, with our library projects, we use this method because those were buildings that were very architectural in nature. So that was kind of, they were different. And so we wanted a high level of design control. In that model, the architect for a building does work for you as the owner. So their professional obligations are to you, and their work is 100% controlled by you as the owner. It's also a method that's well understood by industry participants, and it may, and I give this needs to be in quotes, it may provide the lowest cost for certain projects, although again, even reviewing this for this presentation, there's lots of debate in the industry, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Some of the cons, design bid build projects are linear in their development. So you do that design stage, and then you put that out for bid, and then you do construction. So construction can't start while design is underway. So that's a key factor, particularly for the schools where time is often very important. So you got to do step one to get to step two. Another big difference is that the owner is completely responsible for the work of the architect or the engineers once you get to construction. So if there's an error or omission, you're on the hook for that. And while your contract with the architect or engineer, usually as far as you'll ever get, is they might have to redo their design work for free, but if they left out something, and I'll use a silly example, but let's say with a school, they left out lockers. They just weren't in the bid package, so they did. The contractor didn't bid lockers. Well, the architect is not going to pay for the cost of the lockers. They will pay for the cost to design them because your contract would have that, but they're not going to pay for the missing item itself. So, and usually the mistakes there's always mistakes in any complicated project. They're most often omissions, sometimes they're errors, but they're usually things that were left out. So those things will add to your project cost, and those items, by definition, were not in the bid package, so they weren't competitively bid, so you'll often pay more for those because those are added later. The other thing, and this is something that's a fundamental difference, in order to do design bid build, you have to create the bid package. So you have to have a very complete set of plans, you have to have detailed specifications. For a big job, that'll be like a big book if you printed it all out. So that level of detail and that complex document is not needed in some of the other vehicles. So that's a separate thing that you have to do that has both a cost and a time. And then, I don't want to put too much words here, but information about your cost later on in the development of the project, and then it also can change through time because there's very likely to be change orders in this model. So with design bid build, or design build that we'll talk about in a minute, you get pricing information earlier because you really don't get anything other than estimates until you put that project out on the street and get bids. So once you have a bid, that's a pretty solid price, but then you need a contingency because there's a high likelihood of added cost during the life of the project. So from an owner's perspective, there's more uncertainty in the final price of the project in this method compared to design build, at least in my opinion. It is slow because it is very linear in nature. And in the current market where you do have rapid construction inflation, the slowness of this method could expose the job to more construction inflation, which might offset some of the benefits that you get by competitive bidding. So you have to take both of those into account. And again, depending on the inflationary environment, that may be the more critical factor. You just don't know ahead of time. Another factor I think that's important is the architecture step and the building step are completely separate. So there's really not an opportunity to tailor the job for the person who's going to be building it. And I'll use an example out of home construction that we're all familiar with. So any home builder of any size kind of has 2 or 3 standard houses that they tend to build over and over and over again. And sometimes they'll do a mirror image, or they'll have a set series of additives that they'll do. Excuse me, allergy season. But they tend to get very good at building that particular house. Design builders also usually have some aspects of that because those teams tend to work together over and over and over again. And so they will incorporate things that they know they're good at in their design. So that is one efficiency that you can theoretically gain out of design build, is they will build something that's easy to construct. And I will say one thing we ran into with our library projects, they do have some architectural features. The architect was from, I think, Cleveland, Ohio. Some of the things that they designed were not things that were commonly built here, so the people who had to come build them were not from here either. And if you had done maybe a design build approach, it's likely that some of those features wouldn't have been there, but some of the constructability issues wouldn't have been there either because they would have designed something easier to build, right? So one's not right or wrong, they're just different. One other drawback to design bid build is it does certainly, in my opinion, require the highest workload for the owner because you're overseeing everything. The architect works for you, the contractor works for you, so you're having to manage all of that. This could be a pro or con depending on your perspective, but you have to give the work to the lowest responsive bidder. And I think those are both kind of legal terms in this case, but a responsible bidder is somebody who turns everything in that they were supposed to turn in. In other words, they gave you the bid packet on time, they had it filled out correctly. And then responsive means that they're licensed, they can pull the bond down and do all those things. So if they can do all of those things and they haven't been disbarred to do business in the county or the state, you're obligated to give them the project. And you can't consider how their past projects went, what you think of them, what their reputation is for quality. So you just don't get to select on that basis. And again, that can be good or bad depending on your perspective, but it is a difference. The owner, therefore, has, again, very little input or control over what subs are used because, again, you're not able to select on the basis of any of your perspectives on those people. Another significant drawback, and again, particularly when you consider the context of a school project and maybe time being critical, is in design build, the entity that's doing the building, whether that's the company that made the proposal or the contractor working with them, they know well in advance of construction they're going to be doing the work. So they can start gearing up, they can order things, they can have people available because they know it's their work. And the traditional method, you don't know that until time of project award. So there's often a lag between the date that bid comes back and the award is made and when somebody can start work, because particularly for a big complicated job, there's some mobilization time, there's some lead time. So it takes longer to get work started in the field. And this may be a little bit overstated, but the parties are somewhat inherently in conflict with one another because in this case, the architect works for the owner. So if there's a problem on the project where the contractor says, wait a minute, the plans aren't clear, or you left this out or left that out, they're essentially blaming the architect who doesn't work for them, and then you're left to mediate that dispute, right? So who's right, who's wrong? Should the owner pay more? So you're always in the middle of that because those are two separate entities that have two different sets of interests at hand. Spent a lot of time doing that when I was at the state, a little bit at the county. You can work through that, but again, you need somebody on your team that's got expertise on how to mediate all that. So those are some drawbacks. Moving to design build, I put PPEA in parens because not all PPEA projects are design build. All the ones I've worked with are, but there's other methods that other contracting methods like I think there's something called construction manager at risk, which I haven't worked with. So there's other things you can do, but I'm going to use these interchangeably because I believe that's the proposal you have received is design build, and the ones I've worked with are design build, but it's not limited to that. So in that method, you contract with a design builder who's responsible for essentially pretty much all aspects of project delivery. And you are allowed to consider cost as one factor in who you pick if you have competing proposals. It's usually not your only factor, and you're able to consider other things like past job performance, references, the quality of the proposals, things other than just price. Again, that's very common in the home building industry. So most people in today's market, if you want a house built, you're much more likely to go to a builder who kind of does the design for you, and then you negotiate a price as opposed to getting a set of plans done and trying to shop that around for pricing. You can do both, but I would say the design build is more common in the home market today around here. Some of the pros, again, consider other factors. It is typically faster. It's not guaranteed to be faster, but it's typically faster just because the steps can overlap. So, for example, with a school project, and I'm thinking about CTE when I say this, you could start site work while you're working on building plans because you might know enough about site work to begin site work. And then as you're doing site work, you might be able to start some foundation work and other work as you're finishing up other aspects of your plan. So that does lend itself to speed. Again, the team can come up with things that they think they're going to be good at executing. So that should have some benefits in quality and price, at least potentially. You have a near final price much earlier in the project development, and this is part of that risk allocation because you normally have a guaranteed maximum or a not to exceed price. So, from a budget control perspective, that can be beneficial. The design builder does take on a lot of risks that you have in the traditional design bid build method that the owner has to have. So if the architect makes a mistake in this context, the design build team has to figure that out. That's not your problem. They left out the lockers if that was part of what was expected, and they left it out, and there's confusion over that. They have to work that out. It might be of higher quality. This is not guaranteed, but the reason I say that is because their reputation and their references are important to those teams getting future work. So if they do bad work for somebody else, you're less likely to pick them. So there are some incentives because in traditional design bid build, other than being disbarred, your ability to get the next project just based on your ability to submit the lowest price. Again, that faster delivery timeline reduces the exposure to inflation. The owner has fewer parties to manage, and they're less likely to be in conflict because they are working together. That said, the owner definitely still has to manage these projects, right? They're not self-managing just because they're design build, but there's just fewer things you're responsible for. The construction portion of the team, does have that gear up time, and it's easier for them to stage things because they know for sure they're going to be doing the job. So when you come to things like ordering steel or long lead time items, it's easier to do in this model because you don't have to wait to be selected before the starting gun, so to speak. And again, you have that workload kind of offloaded, so to speak, and essentially you've outsourced some of your project management. Some of the cons, the project is competed from a perspective of you're entertaining separate proposals, but they're not their traditional sealed bids where everybody's bidding on exactly the same thing. It might result in higher pricing, but again, there's lots of debates. If you quickly Google search this, you'll find extreme thoughts on both sides, but then a lot of people, what I tend to believe, that the answer is it kind of depends, right? So there's no way to ever know for sure because you'd have to really run two procurement processes in parallel, and actually in Virginia, you're really not allowed to do that. And in hindsight, it's very difficult to tell which way would have given you the lowest price because, again, some of the time disadvantages of that traditional process might give you a higher price. And back to our library example, there might be some constructability things about the way you designed it that the industry may be nervous about, so they might bid more for that. So At least in building construction, I don't think there's any consensus over which method is cheaper. One other factor I'll bring up in this, and these examples come more from the heavy civil world, a number of very large firms that were doing a lot of design build work for heavy infrastructure have left the market. And the reason they left the market is because they were taking so much inflation risk because they were contracting to do projects that might take 5-6 years to complete. They lost huge amounts of money when you had a lot of construction inflation, so they left the market. So for those projects, the owner probably got a really good deal because the contractor offered something that really wasn't realistic when the time came around. So there's lots of risks there. Another important factor that I think the schools should consider carefully is design build is a little less flexible if you want to make changes along the way once the project has started, because the way the pricing is done is different. So I would think all things being equal, it's probably going to cost you more and take you longer to add things along the way because, again, you don't really have that design control to start with. And you get into this box of, well, you want to change something that they haven't designed yet, or maybe you want to add something. Well, what should that cost? Well, you just have less to work with, I think, in this model. And last point, again, just in general, while you can specify a lot of things in your agreement, you're not going to, you don't have design at that point. You're not going to have a full set of plans. You're likely not to specify every detail that you may later think, well, that's something I wish I had thought of. And I'm going to give a simple example for our public safety building next door. All the county's high security locks, I believe, with this one exception, are Medico locks. They're a county company. We have master keys for Medico, but with public safety building, we did not make that part of our project agreement. So those locks are another high security lock that's a competing company, because there was going to be a price to say we really want Medico locks in our building because it's a county company and they make the locks in Roanoke. We could have put that into the original agreement, but if we were designing it, we might have specified that as part of our specifications, done that in such a way that that was the product you were very likely to have to use. So that's just a small example, but we would have preferred in hindsight to have it be the common key blank and everything, but we didn't tell them to do it that way. We weren't doing the plans, and so those are examples of sometimes things that could happen because, again, you're not designing the work or having it done directly for you. Their design build projects do have some tendency to be somewhat generic if you have a design builder that does a lot of this work, because they're going to kind of come up with a way of doing business that works really well for them. And this is where some of their cost efficiency comes from. So if they do a lot of school projects or whatever, maybe library projects, if we did one with a library, they're likely to have a way of going about it that they're good at doing, that they have done before. And that's the same reason home builders tend to build standard houses. Well, that's also going to mean that your project is likely to look a little bit like somebody else's because they are going to want to do one that they're familiar with. Whether that's a plus or minus just depends on what your goals are. But they do tend to be architecturally less unique for that reason. And then, again, depending on particularly project size, pretty much everybody that's in the industry competes in the design bid build world. Not everybody competes in the design build world because there's additional factors and additional risk that some contractors don't want to take. So some smaller firms may not be able to compete for those types of projects and those types of proposals, so it can limit the playing field a little bit. We didn't have a huge problem with that when we did Bonsai because that's a smaller project, smaller fire station, and a smaller local contractor ended up with that work, but that is just something you run into with who can take on these types of projects. Again, I already mentioned that some folks left the marketplace. And then you do have the public perception issue just because the public is very familiar with design bid build. Whether or not it's the cheapest, there's some perception that that's a good way to do it. So because design build is negotiated, sometimes folks struggle with that. If you're doing a design build project, one of the things you absolutely have to do is have somebody that works directly for you that's doing a good independent estimate of that project so you can make sure that the price that you're getting is appropriate. Some additional factors, I know I'm getting a little repetitive here, but in our opinion, there's no universal right or wrong way to do this. You got to determine what's most important for you as the owner and which method is likely to give you the result that you want the most. Again, for architectural control, I would do the traditional design bid build. If time was most important, design build starts to look more attractive. Another one I think is really important with comparing these methods, and this is common sense, but the owner always pays for the whole price of the whole project. So you can't really directly compare design bid build and design build when you're looking at other people's projects, because a design bid build bid price is usually not the whole project, right? It's not going to include the architecture and engineering. It's not going to include all those professional services. So when you do design build procurement, you're procuring more of the entire job in one fell swoop. So if you look at one method over here and like, what would they pay in that community, to compare it to a design build price, you've got to look under the hood and say, well, what do they pay the architect, right? Because in one model that's lumped up over here, and in the other model you're paying for that separately. So you got to look at the bottom line cost. Looking at what staff resources you have is very important, because if you're going to struggle to manage it or need lots of consultant help to manage it, that may be one of the deciding points with which method is best. And again, in my opinion, there's no way with any certainty you can know which one's going to give you the lowest cost ahead of time. There's too many variables that if anyone could know that, I would say they're in the wrong business and they should be on Wall Street. That's just my opinion, but I don't think you can know that. And then just final thoughts I'll share this evening, and these again are my opinions after many years working with this. I think a good project is one where everybody would go do another one together when you're done, and that means the private sector people made money, you got what you were looking for, and it came in on time and on budget. I've seen some owners feel like they get a good deal if they know for sure that the parties they contracted with lost money. But what happens over time is the next time you go do a project, you're going to get higher prices, right? And that's no matter how you procure it, you're going to get higher bid prices. So in my own opinion, over time, bad owners or difficult owners pay more, good owners pay less, because there is no free lunch. So however you do this, my project goals would be this. And every time I do a pre-construction meeting on a capital project, I say that first line or those first two lines to everybody sitting in the room, and sometimes I get some really surprised look. But I tell all the private sector people that I hope you make money on this project, and I hope it's successful for you. Now, we're not going to pay for your mistakes. If you just totally messed up your bid and it wasn't our mistake and you lost money, that I can't help you with that. But we want you to have a good project. We want you to make money. The other thing I always stress is that if you ever think the county's asking you to do something that's not part of your bid, and we want to pay for that, right? We're not expecting you to do anything for free. So if we change something or you feel we've changed something, please tell us. But we want you at the end of that job to want to do the next project with us. So those are all the slides I have. Doug and I are happy to answer any questions that you have. But again, I think the common theme here is that the methods are very different, and there's a whole lot of variables as to which one you would pick. And again, as you can see from that, maybe third or fourth slide, that we're right at sitting at about 50-50 in which ones we've done as a county. So we see pros and cons to both, and we've used both. And in the future, we will continue to use both, just depending on what the nature of the project is.
Thank you, Richard. Any other questions?
I guess, the cat's out of the bag as far as we're concerned with $90 million. So, I mean, it's going with knowing that what it is, what advantage is it to, a contractor rather than, they're going to come in at 88, or are they going to come in at 85, or?
I would say in my experience that's always going to be true when you're doing a design build in the public sector, where that budget number is always going to be known because it's going to be published somewhere. And at least when I was with the state, sometimes you would actually do that through the front door. You would say, okay, we have $90 million or $130 million. Give us the best proposal that you can do for that price. So the price is set, and you're comparing the work that somebody offers to do for that price. The same thing is true in design bid build, where the budget number is known. And there was one unknown number to the industry, and you all can do the same on either method. So in state world, or in VDOT world, there was always what was called a project control estimate. So you had a published budget number, but then the state had some independent estimators that would also come up with a project estimate. So even though it might have been a low bid environment, sometimes all the bids got rejected because they were rejected as being too high. And so something that will happen with bidding, particularly when contractors are busy, and this also depends on how many bids you get, but sometimes the bids you get are very aggressive contractors who really, really want the work, and they need the work, and they're giving you the best possible price they can. Some of the bids that you will get represent, well, we really kind of got a fair amount of work. If we get this job, we're going to have to use more subs, but we'll give you this price, and if you're willing to pay this much, we're willing to do it, right? You don't know ahead of time which ones are which. In fact, you never know which ones are which, other than hearing about this anecdotally. Sometimes that's all you get, right? Or if you'll give me this much, I'll be thrilled to do it, but they may or may not represent good pricing on the work. So soliciting for bids doesn't necessarily give you great market pricing. It can, and it usually does, but it's not guaranteed to. And then the other thing that can happen that is always a cause of concern for me, and again, this is something that you analyze when you look at them, is if you get 5 bids and 4 of them are really close together, but the one low one is 10% less, unless there's a mistake and they withdraw it, you're going to make that award there, but you're going to really wonder, what do they leave out? And how are they going to prosecute this work? Because they probably made a mistake, especially if they made a mistake and they don't realize it. What are you going to get? So I have worked on jobs that were like that, where the low price was probably a below market price. The person is going to lose money. They do the work anyway, and sometimes those can be very difficult. But I would say that knowledge of the budget is always out there when you do design build in the public sector, because there's no way to hide it. So that's doesn't mean that necessarily gives you a bad price, but it does make it incumbent upon you to have an independent estimate, and then when you do have, or assuming that you would be working with competing proposals, some of that will come out in there, because while they're not bids, certainly, and we've seen this with our own projects, you will get different estimates. Those aren't binding at that point, but you will get different estimates of cost, even though you've got a published budget number, because there's still price is still a factor that you can consider. So it's not the same as a bid, but that element is in there. But you got to be careful with either one.
The other leverage that you do have under the PPEA options, if you do get multiple proposals, you don't have to select one proposal right out of the gate. You can advance, if you get 2, you could advance to the next stage, to where they have to do some work on your behalf for some preliminary architecture or site layout, and providing you with more details, more budget information, and you still have the ability to negotiate. If you get 3, you could advance all 3 and continue to do that. At some point, obviously, you have to make a selection, and you may have some cost along the way, but in the example of the Bonsack Fire Station, we received 2 proposals for it. We advanced both of them to the next stage and asked them both to do some work to be able to help us to make a better decision. Because many of the assumptions are based off of, especially on cost of, a square foot price for whatever the project is, and it allows you to be able to get some more details, and that might help a little bit too with you being able to evaluate exactly what you're wanting to see in the project in terms of kind of owner control of details.
Yeah, I think when we got together, we didn't realize that either, and I'm sure the rest of them did. I mean, thanks. Yeah, y'all help me out here. You got good notepads, but, I don't know about the others. But, anyway, they explained that. And it was good to know that you could carry it on to the next phase.
Yeah.
So that you would be able to. When we did design bid bill for Cave Spring, what happened there? We ended up with a $48 million bid, and that was the only bid. And so we had to drop back and start over. And when we did, we got a 34.3, but we had to add some things, and it came in a little bit more than that. But we added another
Yeah, and there's another factor, and again, I think these are hypothetical, because I'm just gonna pull these out of the air, you can never know this for sure, but let's just say that hypothetically, there was a 5% premium because you did one over the other. In other words, like a, negotiated design build, let's say it was 5% more than a design bid build for the exact same work. That's where you gotta look at when that's gonna happen in time, because if construction inflation was 10%, because it took you longer to get to that bidding stage, well, that method may have saved you 5%, but now you're gonna pay 5% more. So those are, again, it doesn't always work that way, but that's a potential risk. And I feel like, my own opinion is that, particularly with doing something at scale, most of the cost of these things are known close enough that you can get within some kind of margin like that. Like, you could have an estimator come up with, what do you think is going to be a bid price for this if we did it, a traditional method? And you should be in the right ballpark. So I don't think the risk is huge, but it's hard to know exactly what it is. And again, there's no way to ever know because in Virginia, at least, and this may be a legal thing, so I'm not giving legal advice, but just what I understand the law to be, you can't go procure something that you don't intend to award. So you literally, I don't think, are allowed to, in parallel, say, okay, we're going to try to run both methods and get industry to price it, because you can't get people to price things just so you can see, right? You have to intend, your obligation is, if you go out to try to do a method, once you've selected it and put it out on the street, your intent is to make an award on that contract. In other words, you can't use the industry to generate your estimates, is really what the simple way to think about it.
But you go into the second phase before you really need to decide.
Correct, and actually, and I'll get back to our fire station, so we did an interim agreement, so we, at this point, don't have our final price. And so what we did, and Doug can explain this in more detail, but we made a selection of firms, and then in order to really nail down that final price, you've got to do some architecture work, more than what was in the proposals. And then we will determine that guaranteed maximum price, and we'll take that to our board to actually execute the full agreement for the actual contract that will build the project. So at this point, we can walk away, but we have spent some money to do architecture, and you can add a little more detail to that if you'd like, because you're a little bit closer to it.
We wanted to be able to get to at least 80% plans before we locked in the price. So we went ahead and spent paying for the bulk of the design work up front, and then we hope to have that guaranteed maximum price in the next 30, 45 days, and then we'll be able to make a final contract with all of the different options. For us, it was important, HVAC, and that's why we wanted to take this step. I mean, we could have locked in a price, several months ago on the station, but we would have lost a little bit of that control as to what type of HVAC and some other components, for the fire station. And so for us, we felt more comfortable basically paying for getting to 80% plans, where we could then get a price, and our partner was willing to do that as well, and that's part of kind of the give and take with working with the firm. They were comfortable with doing that with us as well.
But with these schools, there's such a level of design that it's hard to do that.
It is, and we recognize the Bonsack. I mean, it's a much smaller,
Right.
Project, and much easier to be able to do in your schools. I mean, they've got a lot of, you've got a lot of design work, but you've also got a lot of content that goes into them. So it makes it much more challenging.
What you said that makes sense that we don't want to hear is that, everybody knows that number before they bring in,
Right.
Obviously private, you'd never do it that way. And so it's just hard to wrap your head around the fact, if we get 10 bids, my guess is they're going to be not to exceed 130 million. So,
It could.
You
It
see what I'm
also could
saying?
be that you could get something at 150 million.
yeah.
I mean, it's in today's market, it's really hard to guess, even though they know budget numbers per se. It just really depends.
And the
on-
inflation factor at this
Yes.
point.
And they're taking much more of the risk with this particular model, so they're going to try to, insulate themselves and have a contingency within that. And ultimately, you do pay that as the owner.
Yeah, because that's the crystal ball part, because the biggest advantage that the method has from a cost perspective is speed. because all things being equal, if you can move fast and there's rising prices. But, you know, from an owner's perspective, you're absolutely right. You are paying for them to take some additional risk. And that's not free. And then it's not, you know, a head-to-head bid. So, you know, theoretically, you lose a little bit of cost advantage there. And again, you got to think of like, A, which one's more important? So even in the private sector, they do a lot of this and they're negotiated, but often for those projects, time is the most critical. I'll use an example, like, you know, you're going to open a hotel and you want to have it there for, you know, the beach season, right? So, you know, you got to be open on like May 1st, because if you're open on August, you lose your best
all that
revenue for the
revenue.
year. Or school, you know, you're going to want to open for back to school. So, you know, and again, on the total opposite end of the spectrum, and I'll use another example that very familiar to people. When the highway department, at least while I was there the whole time, when they do paving work, they advertise those projects in the late fall. You can talk to Rick James about this, he can tell you all about it. Advertise them in the late fall, and then they make the awards usually just before, just after Christmas. So they're gonna tell you, okay, you've got paving schedule for this, you know, a couple counties and so many tons of asphalt. But they've got until the whole end of the paving season to finish the work. So the idea there is that you got all this flexibility, there's fuel adjustments, all the adjustments are in those contracts, because the agency's goal there is to lay as many tons of asphalt as possible at the lowest possible price. But what they give up is all kind of control on schedule of work, priority of schedule, exactly when it'll happen. So in some years, you know, most of the work was done late in the fall because there was a lot of private work, and they did during the most optimum times. And then all the risk was on the agency side, because their thought is, well, we're doing this all around the state, we're doing it in huge quantities. So if it doesn't always turn out great, we think on average it'll be better over time. But, you know, in our world, you know, we're only doing a project or a couple of projects, so our balance is very different, right? And time is important, and we don't want all that flexibility, right? Because you don't want you know, your new CT to open, you know, sometime in a calendar year, just whenever they get around to it, right? That's not going to work for you. So, you know, again, you just kind of weigh all of that.
Do you have penalties for that all as you go? Just like, well, I know they did that bridge down on 220, which the builder went way under. I mean, he is
You
penalized for not finishing
you can-
each day.
Yeah, you can have both penalties and incentives, and I think you can do those in both models. It's just part of the agreement if you're doing design build. You know, what happens if you're late, or what incentive do you have to be early, which I like, but.
Anybody have anything else?
No, sir. Appreciate the information.
Appreciate
Both of you
y'all coming out.
Thank you.
You know, as we shared at the beginning, you know, we're happy to assist in any way that we can. Again, at the end of the day, not our project, so you guys get to make all the important decisions. But if there's ever anything we can help with along the way, we're happy to do so and welcome the opportunity.
Appreciate you clarifying this. Makes it a lot simpler for us to understand. Thank you.
Think of the money we would have saved 4 years ago.
Where were you 4 years ago?
That's where we started the process.
4
4 years ago. Or one.
Thanks, Richard.
Good to see everybody.
Thank y'all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Richard.
Thank you.
See you, Doug.
See you, Doug.
All right,
Thanks,
thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you.
See you, Doug.
Have a good night.
All right, Item 2.02, Introduction to Construction Consultants and Review of RCPS PPEA Guidelines. Mr. Todd Kegels.
And I think most of you have met Curtis Ellswick and Jason Pack from Skanska. They're representing us in the PPA process. They're our consultants. You know, I think it's important to point out that these guys don't have a dog in the fight other than to represent our best interests. So when you ask them questions, you can be sure that they're doing what they think is in the best interest of the school system. They get paid the same no matter what, you know, procurement method we use or what building we choose or what contractor we choose. So they are here today just to ask any questions or answer any questions that you guys might have after hearing Mr. K. Wood and Mr. Blunt.
What questions do you have since you heard it? Did you hear anything that was new?
Well, no, I think they gave an excellent presentation. One thing that I would do is just touch on
some of the items that they brought up, he mentioned releasing early packages as part of the design build contract, and I think that's a great idea. They mentioned structural steel. Another thing to think about are the MEP items like your HVAC units, things like that. If you can start to procure those early on, if you have a process in order to do that, that's another advantage to the design build process. In regards to risk or the perception of additional risk, that's part of the reason that we're here too, is to help you address all of that within the contract or agreement that you will form with that design build firm. Make sure any assumptions and clarifications are spelled out, and make sure any other contract items are taken care of up front. That's the important thing to do, is before a shovel is in the ground, to make sure that your contract terms and everyone's understanding is, everybody's on the same level. The other thing I would touch upon is again, a perception of higher pricing. Something that we typically do with design build contracts is, in order to mitigate that a bit, is to require them to, for each division, each subcontractor that they have involved, is to try to attempt at least to get three subcontractors to price each one of those divisions. You've still got some form of competition out there as well. And then you get to see those numbers as well. I don't know if you had anything else.
No, I thought it was a great presentation, and we've kind of said some of the same things they did in talking with you. But yeah, I think the other thing that you have to consider is the market at the time. This is it's not an owner's market necessarily. It's more of a contractor's market because everybody's busy. And like they said, some people put in competitive prices and some people don't need the work. So they say, here's our price. If you want to, we'll take it. But this is definitely a unique market. There's still escalation that has to be considered, but the big one is, can you get the materials in time to turn the air on, to do the finishes in the building and that sort of thing. And you really cannot do that in design bid build right now, unless you just give the contractor a lot of time. So if you're trying to open a school in the summertime so you can occupy, you really need the contractor and the architect and the team together, figuring out when do I need to procure the switchgear and get that on order early. You can do that under this PPA process, but not necessarily on design bid build. So I think the market drives a lot of what delivery method or what procurement method you're going to choose.
So you could end up costing more, design bid bill, if you wait and not knowing what the costs are. If you get a little bit ahead of time and you get a better time frame, I guess. And you can sort of dictate a time frame a little better, or ask a time frame, whatever it may be.
And I think the gentleman, I don't think they put it in these terms, but I consider a PPA I call it a business deal. They call it, they talked about it's a negotiation. It really is. It's really figuring out up front, whatever they propose, one has this price or that price, what are you getting for those prices? So you got to really ask a lot of good questions on making sure you understand what are you getting in each one and trying to get them apples to apples. And you may like the one that costs more better because you get more value out of it or more scope. So it's really your decision. But like you said, you got to flip up the hood and figure out what's in these proposals and ask a lot of questions to make sure you're comfortable.
Because right now, you don't have a set of plans.
You got a concept.
Yeah, you got a concept. And that's what they've priced, is a concept.
So what, I know, like even going through the Bird project, I'll point to one thing that was my fault. So, I know after the fact, originally, like in the cafeteria there, there wasn't a lot of thought to a lot of the work that would be done there because it was a relatively new renovation on that part. But, I had the bright idea one day, again, my fault, looking at just the light fixtures and so forth, and they just looked horrible, and they were dark, and just wasn't a nice, bright environment in there, and so we actually changed that. What strategies, would you all use, I guess, as our consultants to help? I mean, obviously we want, our principals to give input, especially in the renovations, in terms of things they like to see differently. We want all that input. Obviously we rely on you guys with your expertise to help us not miss things. Are there certain things that or a certain process you use to help us not miss things?
Well, the one thing we almost always, we're doing a PPA, we're doing accounting, 6 of them right now. And most of them are schools, some are courthouses. But, one thing we want to nail down early on is, like I said, what are you getting, right? So write us a narrative and explain exactly what type of HVAC system you're proposing, and we have the right to negotiate and change it. But what types of flooring are you proposing in the different areas of school? What type of, X, Y, Z, whatever. But you got to be able to ask those questions. They may not just tell you. So, the proposals you may get, one may be very definitive and explain in very, multiple pages, here's what we propose. The other one just may say, we're going to give you a school this size, and they may not tell you. So you got to really ask the questions and make sure your staff or whoever's going to have input, understands what you're getting, and to give them a chance to say, I like that, I don't like that, can we change it? Before you sign that first contract, whether it's an interim agreement or a comprehensive agreement.
Are all those things, things that we can still negotiate during that interim agreement phase? That's one, I think you all have suggested, don't go to a final comprehensive agreement, go to the interim agreement as a next phase. Once we get past this, if we decide we're gonna do a detailed phase or not, but do interim agreement, not final, because that still gives you a lot of input.
Which
Yeah,
could be two.
unless the schedule is such a driver that you have to go to a comprehensive agreement, sign up for everything on day one, which leaves a lot of gray area. You really don't know exactly what you're getting. In our experience, we've always proposed doing an interim agreement where you're going to pay them, like these gentlemen said, to do some design work, right? And really define at 75% or 90% design, whatever it is, so you know exactly what you're getting before you sign that next contract for that guaranteed maximum price. So we propose that method so you have a better idea and a little bit more control of, what are you going to get for that price that you establish on day one.
And that'd be competing in that second phase. You could still have two competing, right?
If you choose more than one to go to what's called the detailed phase, then you're going back to each one with your comments on their proposal, right? I like this, I didn't like that, what about this? It seems like you left this out, those kind of things. But then you pick somebody before you enter into that contract. When you pick somebody, that's when you really nail down and attach to that contract what you're expecting to get. So it's in writing.
Yeah.
So when we get to an interim agreement, that's only with one team.
Correct.
Right.
You can't enter into two. So.
Do you see either of these two methods work better for, or either of these two methods work better for new construction as opposed to a remodel?
We do it on both projects. We're doing renovations and new construction on the PPA, and we've done design bid build, so I wouldn't say there's a major difference. In my perspective, I don't know if you have an opinion.
Yeah. Years ago, we did, for Montgomery County, the 3 schools that they have there, Blacksburg High School and then Auburn High School, but then Auburn Middle School was a renovation of the old Auburn High School. So, that was all packaged into a PPA agreement, very similar to this. It worked out fine.
I think the only thing is, under a design build effort, the whole team is there working together. That's the theory, right? And then, for renovations can be complicated, the phasing, especially if you're going to occupy the school when you're building onto it and renovating. So it gives the team a chance to figure out those logistics before the design's finished versus bidding it out and the contractor come back and go, oh, that's not going to work. And there's going to be a delay and you're going to have to shut down school. So there are some advantages, I think, of having everybody together, figuring it out early.
Yeah, you get the contractor's buy-in on the phasing, and then never get to that. That helps out a lot.
And tomorrow's the last day for turning in, and we've only got the one, right?
We actually have another one received just like this afternoon.
Okay.
Before this meeting, so.
We got two.
So I think the bottom line is you have to ask a lot of questions.
You've got a detail.
You gotta ask a lot of questions. I'm
pretty
really good at
intense
that,
up
says my
front.
Well,
husband.
yeah,
by the way.
we depend on y'all to know
Too
the
many
stuff. I mean, this is new territory.
That's kind of the way I
My
see it. I
kids
mean,
too.
obviously, we need to rely on our consultants as far as the, for lack of a better term, all the structural kind of details and that kind of stuff. When it comes to just preferences, like a principal might say, well, I've always wanted this kind of furniture in the library or something like that. That gets into their preferences, not something, they can help us with that, but you know what I'm saying? Those two components, I think, that come into play. So, and both are important.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, we really appreciate you coming out and kind of clarifying some of this stuff.
Yeah. And meeting with us individually helped a lot, even though Tim asked all the questions.
They're all
We
good.
tried to convince him, but he kept going back to that dollar figure, so. You feel better now?
Well, we'll see where we get to. I mean, like I said, we've got a $130 million concept. We don't have anything, but, let's see.
Yeah, but I
Let's see
mean,
where it goes.
yeah.
So, but, the bottom line is, we have to do, no matter what process we pick, we've still got to do the design phase. Even if we went back and said we'd do a design bid build, still got to do the design. It's still going to take us 6 to 8 months, whatever it is, 5, 6, whatever it is, to get that design hammered out. And as these guys have said, they got to go in these schools and see them because they don't know what they're getting into. Just like Cave, you remember we had the circle or whatever you had, and so
Yeah, the Oxford.
if we had done this PPE there, they may have given us that concept and not even had an idea that was there.
But we know what happened
Yeah.
in that whole process, which got delayed and,
But so-
and we do have a better cost, I think, if, as you were saying, to get together and you get a better, quicker, I can order this number of HVAC units, or I can order the flooring, I can order whatever was in there and get that coming, so it's gotta cut down on your time as far as, it's gonna take to do it, so. But like you said, we told them, here's 130 million, go spend it, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what government does.
So,
We got this money.
and we're there,
burning a hole in the
so I mean,
pocket.
either we
Yep.
move forward or not, or, say, well, let's delay it for a while, and play the game of cost. That's the whole, the building, that better
Yeah,
than I
absolutely.
do.
That's why I've asked so many questions.
But I mean, so, time is money.
That's right.
So,
4 years ago, we'd have been a lot further with our money. A lot more money we'd have had to.
where were we 4 years?
We better move
The
on.
companies that have submitted some proposals have spent a lot of time already. At the elementary schools.
So they have been in there?
Yes, sir, they have.
Good.
We
Oh, good.
provided maintenance staff who toured them through all the mechanical systems and
Well, that's
came in and
good.
looked
That's
at all the floor
positive.
plans, yes.
Okay.
We've already done what's the asbestos report, the
The NESHAP.
So
Done
we
that.
already have that lay of the land, so they've been advised what they need to do in response to that. One thing that happened with the Bird project is, you have these sort of pre-proposal meetings where people can ask questions, like, try to find, what do you guys envision? What do you want to see? And of course, the principals also had some input, and frankly, that was a huge factor in, the company we went with, was who was listening, who was responsive to what we were saying that we're looking for, right? So, I mean, I like the idea that you can actually work with people who seem to be responsive to what you're asking for, and I think that's a huge piece of this.
Yeah, a lot of this is picking the right partner.
Well, we thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Mr. Ray,
Yes, sir.
would you read us into closed?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I move that the Roanoke County School Board convene in closed session to the following: to discuss the acquisition of real property for a public purpose where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position and negotiating strategy of the school board pursuant to the real property exemption at 2.2-3711A3 of the Code of Virginia.
Second?
Madam Clerk?
Yes, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.